welcome to today's webinar, Protecting the 2020 Elections in the Age of Facebook. Welcome. Today I am joined by four panelists. Ángel Díaz from the Brennan Center for Justice. Yael Eisenstadt is the former global head of elections integrity operations for political advertising at Facebook. Myaisha Hayes is the campaigns director at MediaJustice, where she oversees the launch of campaigns such as No Digital Prisons and Protect Black Dissent. And Jesse Littlewood is the vice president of campaigns at Common Cause, which is training election protection social media monitors to combat cyber suppression in their communities. So welcome, everybody. And I wanted to start off with a toss-up question that'll kind of set the stage for what's to come. I was hoping someone could tackle this and let us know, what do you think are the greatest threats to democracy and to vulnerable groups posed by social media companies like Facebook? Yael, did you want to jump in?
I mean, I don't know if you want to assign this to somebody. I can give a few initial thoughts.
Excellent.
And others can chime in as well. Hi, it's great to be with all of you. Just to add, you gave my former title, but I'm currently a visiting fellow at Cornell Tech. So just to set the stage a little bit, there's so much talk right now about Facebook's effects on democracy, about social media's effects on democracy. This is what I talk about. This is what I just did a big talk about recently. It is just one piece of the puzzle. So I'm going to scene set with, we have an election right now where we actually have what one would call political elites intentionally sowing disinformation and distrust about the voting process, about our electoral process, doing everything they can to make sure people don't trust the outcomes. This is happening in traditional media. This is happening in social media. This is happening on certain partisan news channels. And so just to be really clear, it's all part of a broader info ecosystem that is very concerning. But since this conversation is about social media, you know, one of the biggest difference is that whereas on general media, on partisan media, whether it be newspapers, whether it be cable news networks, I mean, there's various ways to look at this. When you turn on that cable news network, you are at least seeing the same thing that everybody else who turns on that cable news network is seeing. You're all hearing the same messages. You also know what you're there for. You know, if you go on to MSNBC, you're seeing one perspective. You know, if you go into Fox News, you're seeing another. But when you go onto a social media platform, especially one like Facebook, which is supposed to be about connecting with your friends and it's supposed to be about meaningful conversations, and yet you don't actually understand how you're being targeted, how your information is being curated, what you're seeing is all some part of an intentional decision and a design choice, that's where it becomes more concerning in some cases. And that's where some of the tactics that can be used to really engage in voter suppression can really engage in destroying some of our abilities to all coalesce around at least a shared set of facts. The opaqueness behind all of it, the inability to truly understand how that's all working, that's a huge concern. So my concerns are very long-term, but we have an election happening. It started already. So there is this crisis moment now, and hopefully we'll get into some of the what can we do about it right now, and then what would we like to see for the longer term for a healthier info ecosystem. So that would just be sort of my general opening thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful place to start. So hi, everyone. I hope everyone who's tuning in is doing okay as well as can be during these times. My name is Myaisha Hayes. I'm the campaign director at MediaJustice. And for those who are unaware of the work that we do, our mission, we're an organization that's based in the Bay Area. We're a national organization, and our mission is to advance the communication and digital rights of communities of color. And as a movement-centered organization, we have to be really clear about what are some of the unique threats that communities of colors are facing. And media platforms such as Facebook have been driving a lot of hate speech that we've all seen can result in real life tragedies and violence against communities of color. You know, when I first started when I first joined the team at MediaJustice, it wasn't too soon after the police shooting of Corinne Gaines. And as folks may remember, Corinne Gaines was a woman who had actually recorded her encounter with the police that were at her front door and had posted this live feed, you know, on her Facebook account. And this feed was live until the local police department, the Baltimore Police Department, had contacted Facebook about taking that feed down. And once that feed was taken down, Corinne Gaines was found dead. And, you know, since then, we've seen a number of ways in which Facebook's platform has undermined the safety of Black lives and has really ignored some of the concerns that have come out, not just from MediaJustice, but several other organizations that are concerned about our privacy and our civil rights on that platform. MediaJustice also leads a campaign called Protect Black Dissent. And one of our allies in that campaign is an organizer from Tennessee who had been, you know, targeted by police surveillance. And one of the tools that they had used was Facebook, and creating fake accounts to basically track and identify different activists in the area, to basically map out, you know, different associations, and to basically ultimately put people on a blacklist to prevent them from entering the state capitol, which is where obviously a lot of our demonstrations are happening when we're talking about, you know, speaking truth to power. And so there's this side around like the platform where we've been concerned about police use of Facebook, but then there's also this other issue around hate speech and the way that the far right and white supremacist groups have been able to mobilize on Facebook. Even in the most recent case with Kanisha, the event page that was online, as folks may already know, was reported, you know, over 450 times, and yet that page wasn't taken down because the content moderators didn't see the Facebook page as violating Facebook's rules. And so there's a real issue around enforcement that I want to touch on a little bit later, about some of the reasons why I think Facebook might be uniquely bad, but not certainly different than any other spaces that we're talking about.
Thank you. Angel or Jesse, did you want to jump in with any additional thoughts?
So yeah, I'm happy to jump in. In a particular, Common Cause is focused in this 2020 election on stopping cyber suppression, which is kind of a, you know, specifically the disinformation that could cause eligible voters to be disenfranchised through disinformation that comes through the platforms. We monitor Facebook and other platforms in a variety of different ways to work to prevent it. And as Yael, you know, mentioned, you know, one of the big challenges is that we're seeing the platforms be gamed by disinformation actors in order to spread disinformation. And those disinformation actors include individuals who have huge reach in offline media as well as online media, because they are, for example, the President of the United States. So that creates a real challenge for, I think, the platforms to be able to respond in ways that live up to the duty that they profess when they talk about their civic integrity. They, in particular, Facebook has been challenged and has fallen down when it hasn't actually followed its own policies or strengthened them to the degree that it is necessary in order to prevent disinformation, especially about including about voter suppression that goes out over the platform. One of the particular pieces of evidence that I find troubling is in the civil rights audit that Facebook conducted. There was, in that report that was released by Facebook, showed that when people would flag the voting and elections related posts that were disinformation or could be used as vote suppression, when users flagged those on the platform, they weren't seen by an individual to actually moderate. It was treated as content feedback in a way that wouldn't necessarily escalate it to the way that it should have been, because you could then take action on it. So there's a huge duty of responsibility that the platforms have, and they certainly are profitable, and Facebook especially is certainly profitable enough to be able to take stronger action to make sure that any attempts at disenfranchising voters are removed from the platform. And I think it's important to note that it has to do with not only advertising, but also organic content, or the content that just users post, folks like us, but also people who have large reach through campaign infrastructure or through their own influence. Facebook time and time again has pointed to changes in its advertising ecosystem as its solution to the problem, when it's in fact far beyond that. We've seen disinformation around the integrity of our elections be spread on Facebook as some of the highest engaging organic content. Researchers and journalists like Kevin Roos have been documenting through Facebook's own analytics tool that these are some of the consistently highest performing in terms of engagement posts that happen on the platform. And that's being, in effect, utilized by partisans to game the platform to push a particular line of disinformation, especially now about the elections. And that's a major challenge for the platforms, but also something that, the good news is there's something that we also can do to respond to and to help combat.
Hey everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm going to try to not repeat what's already been said by my co-panelists here who raised really good points. I think that at a high level, the way that at least I think about it is that we have not just Facebook, but Google, Twitter, any number of other major platforms struggle to deal with the disinformation and hate speech that can come from elected officials, and at the same time have a very overbroad, clunky solution for regulating the content of ordinary users, and particularly users of color. And that's sort of a recipe for disaster. And ultimately, when it comes to the problems that we're about to face going into election, this is no secret. It's not something that we couldn't have seen coming, or that requires a sort of ad hoc response. It's something that could have easily been predicted, and we could have put together policies way sooner than now. And instead, we're sort of reacting to each news cycle as it hits us. And ultimately, I think there's a, we have to think about what it means to have these private companies who are sort of not inclined to stand up to political power and have no real incentive to protect the views of marginalized groups in mass, and instead sort of put together these policies that can look very nice or thoughtful at first, but when you think about how they're applied, you start to see a much different story.
Excellent, thank you. And this next question is for Myaisha. It's kind of the case often that activist groups in the US have a hard time connecting disparate issues. So some people might think that promoting racist violence on Facebook isn't directly connected to the 2020 elections and US democracy. Can you talk about, what directly connects all these things up and how they're interlinked?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Sure. So, a lot of the times in the US, with activist communities and groups, there's some siloing of different threads happening, different issues. So my hope was that you could sort of walk us through how the promotion of racist violence on Facebook is actually connected to the threats to our elections and to our democracy, and what the through line between all of those things is.
Well, I think the through line is that Mark Zuckerberg's bottom line is profit. Facebook, as Ayala had pointed out, is marketed to us as a platform to connect us. And in some ways, it obviously does that. We can point to several moments in history recently in movement work where Facebook was an incredible tool to connect our people, to get out information, to organize rapid responses, and so forth and so on. But the bottom line for Mark Zuckerberg as a business is to make money and to make profit. And profit will always come over the lives of Black bodies, and certainly the concerns of Black voices, Black and brown voices. When we talk about misinformation and disinformation, it's important to remember that they know that this is an issue. I don't even know where to start, honestly, with the amount of studies that exist about the bias and political advertising, the disproportionate enforcement around content moderation. I mean, studies after studies after studies have indicated that just the way that Facebook is set up really exacerbates the proliferation of hate speech and misinformation or disinformation on its platform. And they intentionally don't do anything, not because it's a tech issue, not because it's out of their hands to do something about it, but because as an ethical or probably a business standpoint, they choose not to do something about it because this stuff is profitable for them. When civil rights groups and racial justice groups pressured Facebook to conduct a civil rights audit, they also had hired Republican John Kyle to produce an anti-conservative bias report, which, again, in light of the fact that there are so many studies that prove and indicate that false news, that disinformation actually spreads much faster and wider than actually verified content. Despite, the ways in which Black and Brown folks are silenced on their platform, despite all of this evidence, they brought in someone to assess conservative bias. And if folks were watching the antitrust hearing that happened in July, this narrative came up again. It is a consistent talking point from the right. It's a consistent talking point that gives Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook the sort of, I think, protection, maybe, to not take hate speech and disinformation seriously, right? And so, yeah, that's one point that comes to mind.
And what is your take on, from an institutional standpoint, the fact that if you kind of look at any snapshot on any given day of the most shared news items, despite their small reach, many of those do come from, right-wing outlets. You mentioned the, profit motive underlying kind of all actions. Do you think those two things are intimately linked in that, these people have found a home here and there's not any good business sense to do anything about it?
Well, the reason why I identified profit as the through line is because the policies are there, the recommendations are there. I know Twitter is not like the perfect platform, but they have done things and enforced policies to sort of mitigate some of the harms that we're discussing here. Facebook could be a leader in this issue, and they're choosing not to. Because this sort of information is profitable. And at the end of the day, this is an advertising business, right? And so I don't really see any motivation from their leadership, especially since we've seen, I've also shared like the studies, right? But then also real life issues, real life consequences, real violence against communities of color that started on Facebook through chats, through event pages that were reported and then never taken down. Facebook has an obligation to enforce these policies. And in my eyes, the repeated lack of leadership indicates a lack of will. So yeah, I saw some other people on mute, so I want to give folks some space to respond to that question too.
I was going to quickly jump in on sort of something from the first question, which was about the siloing of conversations. I think that we're in a moment, particularly where folks are being a lot more critical about the biases that exist in algorithms and the way in which automated tools are sort of ill-equipped to do a number of things that people say they can do. And there's a lot of skepticism about Facebook, rightfully so, but a lot of that skepticism seems to sort of drop away when we talk about you should use automated tools to remove all hate speech before it's ever loaded. The idea that we're going to trust platforms to have the tools to meaningfully understand how communities of color use the internet and how to develop tools that can moderate their speech patterns, it's just like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that there are meaningful ways that they have just straight up failed to moderate content that was being targeted against communities of color. But I think that reliance on automated tools as a solution for them is more likely to make the problem worse. And I think that to the question about, what is particularly concerning about Facebook, it's that we have a lot of studies and we have a lot of information, both internal and external. For example, the way in which Facebook's recommendation engine for groups is driving a lot of the joining of QAnon. The fact that they are promoting groups further in the newsfeed after they themselves have found that this same recommendation engine is the one that's promoting people to join potentially violent groups, it just sort of, it either one hand not talking to the other, but there just seems to be a sort of, either resistance or willful ignorance about what it is that's going on the platform, and instead just kind of plowing ahead.
I'll just jump in with the thought here as well, since you guys both set that stage so well. So obviously these are huge challenges, and under the current sort of incentive structures right now, do I have the answer for exactly how Facebook can fix this? No. I mean, I do, but it would include destroying their entire business model. But do I have an answer for how they can fix this before the election? No. But I just want to kind of point out something here. In general, in the US, we sort of have 4-5 mechanisms that are usually what work to sort of help correct course, help hold companies accountable, right? So first you have the free markets. That is, a lot of people love to use the idea of the free markets. It's very clear that the free markets are not correcting for this particular situation. When Facebook was fined $5 billion by the FTC that very same day, the stock market rallied because they knew, well, that they can afford. They didn't know new laws were passed. Nobody had handcuffs put on them. No one was taken to jail. Cool, the markets rallied. So the free markets are not the ones, if we can all agree that what we are seeing right now in the social media world and in the info ecosystem isn't the world we want to see, then we should be able to agree that the free markets haven't solved it. And the second group is usually shareholders. Well, so shareholders can't, and I'm saying this all because I believe that this audience is an audience of people who want to kind of know what can we do about it. So the second is usually shareholders, but in the US, shareholders have some sort of power over companies, and they're the ones who also get to incentivize trying to have the board hold the leadership responsible for certain things. Unfortunately, Facebook, with their dual class structure, they're set up in a way where actually nobody can hold Mark Zuckerberg accountable. Shareholders can scream all they want. The board can even say whatever they want. He has final say. So shareholders don't have that power. And the third may be employees. And it is interesting. We're starting to see more and more employees stand up and talk about what they think is wrong. And I think we should both encourage those voices and support them. Unfortunately, though, I'm not really sure. We'll see if at some time in the long run, Facebook has trouble hiring the best engineers. Right now, I'm not sure that it's enough. And the last is law. It's are they breaking the law? And unfortunately, our US laws haven't caught up. And this is where I focus the most. I mean, even just the most basic thing like political advertising. I do not think political advertising is the most dangerous thing happening in social media right now, but it's one that should be the easiest to regulate. We have laws in the United States of America around political advertising, whether it be on television or whether it be in newspapers. And yet for the life of us, we can't seem to apply those same laws to the digital world, and it makes absolutely no sense. We have allowed the CEOs of for-profit huge companies to write their own rules about what they will or won't do in terms of transparency around advertising, about whose money they will or won't take, about how they'll report about it, about whether or not they're even going to verify that the person on the disclaimer that says paid for by is actually that person. Like, we have ceded all of that. And so all of the usual mechanisms in the United States that hold a company accountable for their effects on society are failing. And so we really need to think about that. Personally, I know that people yell at me when I talk about legislation and how that won't fix everything. Nothing will fix everything. There's not one magical solution that anybody here, and if you have the magical solution, you're going to be my hero. But I don't think any of us has the one magical solution that's going to make for a healthier, more equitable information ecosystem that works for us as opposed to for certain corporate leaders. That said, we should be able to write certain basic guardrails and certain basic rules for how to hold platforms accountable. Again, for me, it's not about censorship or free speech. I'm not asking us to hold Facebook accountable for if an individual posts misinformation. I don't think that Mark Zuckerberg should be in the business of being the arbiter of truth. I'm asking us to think about who's accountable for what tools they are providing a political operative to target us with disinformation and suppress the vote. That's what I want them held accountable for. Or I'm asking them to hold the company accountable for if their tools actually connected, if their recommendation engines connected people and recommended them into a group, and then within that group, they hatched out a plan and then went and commit violence in the real world. These are the things, but right now, none of that exists. And so what I'm hoping people like you do is continue to speak up and say, this is, you don't have to have all the solutions, but you can tell your representatives, this is important to me. And I really hope you as my elected official also think this is really important and are working to figure out how our laws can catch up to the current info ecosystem. So I know that was very soapboxy of me, but that's just sort of my high level ideas on that one.
That's good. This is the perfect forum for soapboxy ideas, so no need to apologize for that. And I wanted to take that last sort of statement as a departure point. You were sort of saying these are some things that should be, easy things to start with, and direct this next question at Jesse. The European Union, for example, has some data protection laws and GDPR that we don't have the analog of that here in the United States. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about, the difference in how we approach, those sorts of regulations overseas versus in the United States, and whether you think that might be helpful as a starting point here in the US.
So I'll agree with Yael that there's no one magic solution for all of these problems, but it would be a strategic error not to look to where social media platforms and technology companies have been reined in and helped steered towards serving the public interest in a stronger way in other contexts. So, the laws like the UK's and perhaps beyond GDPR is certainly a good place to begin. I'll also jump on the legislative bandwagon and highlight that the Honest Ads Act is a piece of legislation that is in Congress right now that could bring transparency into online advertising. And I think even sort of more boldly, but also more critically, it's folded into a more broader omnibus democracy package known as the For the People Act. And to me, the reason that is also important is one of the challenges of passing legislation is the obstinance and the unwillingness to change the business model and to be regulated by the platform. But you may not choose to believe him, but Mark Zuckerberg has expressed support for the Honest Ads Act. And the challenge there is the people who are oftentimes most opposed to these kinds of regulatory behaviors may not even be the platforms or the industries being regulated, but the people who are using the current system to their advantage. So the big money donors and the special interests who appreciate the fact that they can have untraceable or non-disclosed ads on platforms, and their ability to make a strong showing in Congress and to stop legislation. So one of the challenges, I think, of bringing a policy solution or any of the solutions that we can bring to the platforms has to do with the regulatory bodies that we're working with. And I see the challenge that Facebook has is part of a broader challenge to democracy that needs addressing in a couple of different areas. Facebook, can do a lot more to advocate and use their position in the market, as well as their position as a big voice of influence in the halls of power to make the case to bring regulation to their industry. But it's not necessarily the only people who have influence that are opposing that, or the platforms themselves. So it's important that we think a little broader about how to build the power, not just to hold the platforms accountable, but to force the folks who have access to the levers of power to make that happen regardless.
I was also going to share that obviously, in addition to like legislation, there are things that, you know, we can be doing in our own communities, such as really sort of prioritizing more political education and media literacy. I feel like maybe a few years ago, like, I don't know, I feel like there was a period of time in which our generation was really knowledgeable about sort of the media conglomerates and who really owned our media. And there was a great deal of media literacy that that folks were sharing. And I think we need another like sort of generation of that leadership. And that's actually something that MediaJustice is working on. So we're part of the Disinfo Defense League, which is basically just a rapid, rapid response, short-term network to address misinformation and disinformation during the elections that are targeting Black and Brown communities. And so like a lot of it is around sort of building up our own literacy around how to spot disinformation, such as, you know, for instance, and I've said misinformation and disinformation intentionally because disinformation is usually understood as the maliciously trying to spread false information and propaganda, whereas misinformation may be less intentional. So a lot of disinformation can happen much more privately in like group chats or in certain like private group online spaces. But when that information starts to trickle out, let's say there's someone saying that ICE is at the polling station, in an effort to actually like protect your community, people might spread that information not knowing that it's false. And so now it, you know, becomes misinformation. And so there's a lot of things like that, right? Like trying to understand how do you spot things that are false, like checking the source, checking the date, understanding the context, understanding who are your trusted sources. It's very similar to how MediaJustice might approach sort of digital security, right? There's no one perfect solution and there's no one perfect way to keep your stuff secure, but there are ways to sort of exercise your literacy to understand how to pinpoint different threats that are coming your way. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And we got a question from the folks listening in right now, and I want to direct this one at Angel. They wanted to know if there were any resources or trainings available at the individual level to sort of combat misinformation by, you know, online literacy kinds of teachings or lateral reading, that sort of thing, and where might folks be able to find that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, Myaisha just sort of gave a really good overview of sort of the basics of like, you know, how to look online to make sure that you're looking at something that's true, that's not recycled from way behind. In terms of, you know, I think various different civil society organizations have put together sort of ways to combat it. I'm not sure if Common Cause has one, but like Tech Accountability Project has one. I think a few others have some as well. So if some come up to mind, please jump in. You know, ultimately, I think that part of what's difficult about social media is that there's always going to be this kind of information online, and that to a certain extent, there is no solution to completely eradicate any of the things that we're concerned about. And that isn't necessarily the goal, but it is, you know, there is going to be one component, which is having people be better able to find it when it's there. But there also needs to be more accountability on the platform side to remove content at a better scale than it is doing now. But I think that, you know, one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is sort of legislation and sort of what role might sort of legislators have. And I think that some of the things that have been brought up are good ones. I think that there's more and more uniformity in agreeing that it doesn't make sense to have sort of the platforms say what their rules are and then tell you how well they're doing at enforcing them. So having a more uniform obligation to disclose what they're taking down, who it's affecting, which communities are being impacted the most, seems like a pretty basic first step. But I would once again warn, Myaisha's work touches on like protecting Black dissent. There is a reality that the more that you get the government involved in the business of regulating speech, they are most often going to go after communities of color that are speaking out against them. And so whether it's this like fictionalized Black identity extremism movement or other things like that, we have a long history of seeing what government does to use speech laws to suppress dissent. So we should remain wary of sort of believing that regulation is going to be the solution to all these problems. Again, there isn't a magical solution. I would say be wary if anyone says they have one, because they're probably wrong.
I just want to second that. It is just to be clear, I do not think the government has any right. Actually, it's not even legal for the government to regulate what speech should or should not be up or down. So I just want to add on that is not at all what I'm advocating if I ever gave that impression. I totally agree with what Ángel said. I think there's a role for government to play. But a lot of people in the tech industry who want to try to discredit those of us who try to talk about smart legislation love to talk about how we're trying to censor speech. So let's be clear, there are detractors that are, there's a reason why people try to classify anyone who talks about, and by the way, I don't mean that anyone here did that. I just mean often that will be the public talking point you'll hear.
I wanted to follow up. Yeah, you are part of a group that's the Real Facebook Oversight Board, which is positioning itself as an alternative to the official advisory board. Could you talk a little bit about that effort and what role you think that might play in Facebook? Sure.
So I'm going to start with saying something that's going to sound counterintuitive. For me, the things I personally focus on are not so much content moderation. I focus actually on the systemic underlying reasons why this business model actually incentivizes bad speech and bad behavior, as opposed to the whack-a-mole game of what should be taken down and what should be left up. I say all of that because then you have the Facebook Oversight Board. And for those who don't remember what this is, it's Facebook's effort, they called it their Supreme Court, to build this external advisory board to eventually weigh in and have weigh in on, at first, content that has been removed and that has been appealed, and their decisions are supposed to be binding. And so here's what's interesting. I think it's a really interesting experiment. I think it's a long-term experiment. I don't think it's anything that's going to have immediate impact right now. And so the reason we put together this effort is more of a crisis response for, can we talk about what's happening right now ahead of this election? And even more concerning to me, what happens from November 3rd until whenever the election results are actually legitimately final. And so what we are creating, yes, of course, it's tongue in cheek. It's called the Real Facebook Oversight Board. But unfortunately, Facebook's actual oversight board is not even operational yet. So they're not going to have any impact. And to be honest, a group of like 15 people who have a 90-day turnaround to make a decision about one piece of content is not going to have, they could have some really interesting longer term effects, but they're not going to affect this election. So we pulled together about 25 people. It's a really interesting group. You have the head of the ADL, you have the head of Color of Change, you have the heads of the NAACP. So you have the civil rights community, and then you have people who, yes, they call us tech critics. You've got me, you've got Shoshana Zuboff, you've got a bunch of tech critics, and you've got some journalists, you've got Maria Ressa, like names that if you've been following these things, you've hopefully been following their work. And we've all come together to at first just highlight the issues that we are concerned about ahead of this election. And then we're going to start, I think, on probably a weekly basis, doing what we thought the Facebook Oversight Board would have been doing. And that's actually discussing decisions, not just content decisions, but I think Myaisha was the one who brought this up earlier. It's an enforcement question. There are rules. I tried to write some of those rules when I worked at Facebook. I actually was at Facebook when the civil rights audit was going on, and I tried to create a voter suppression policy for political advertising, and it was rejected. And I've written about that already, so you can find my article about that. But when you have policies and then you refuse to enforce them because you are too afraid of either the political pressure that you might receive, the blowback you might receive, definitely not wanting to anger the party that could actually not just regulate you, but take away, I would say, the gifts that you are getting through complete immunity for certain things, of course, people are going to see that your policy carries no weight if you're not enforcing it evenly. And so what we want to do is just continue to shine a light. Do we think we're going to change Facebook? I don't know. Do we think it is very important to continue shining a light on the things that are going wrong, on the effects they're having, and on really helping the public understand and see some of what's happening? Yes. And so we'll see. I mean, I do know that maybe it's a coincidence, but the second they found out we were launching this, they moved up the start date of the Oversight Board to October. They weren't supposed to start until next year. So, hey, maybe that's a positive. I do believe our first show will be coming out probably today. Kara Swisher interviewed a bunch of us to talk about it. So that should be coming out today or tomorrow as well. But the goal really is, for me, it's all about accountability. As everyone here, I think, has somehow in one way or another pointed to, I don't expect Facebook to be perfect. These are really tough decisions. Things will fall through the cracks. Machine learning can only get better with time. There will be mistakes. Human moderators are always going to make mistakes. I don't expect them to be perfect. I expect them to be accountable, though, for their decisions, and I expect them to be accountable to the public, and right now they're not. So that's sort of some of our goals.
Excellent. And I want to direct this question towards Jesse. One of the big ingredients in Facebook is us. We as the users are generating all the content on which their business model is built. So what can Facebook users do in the next 30 days to mitigate the negative impacts? We should have some power here as the users, but I think it's it's difficult for people to wrap their heads around at the individual level, particularly, is there anything I can do? What is that thing? So what can we do as individual users?
So from the position of particularly thinking about voter suppression, which includes not only the disenfranchisement of individuals, which, to be clear, is almost always targeted at communities of color, individuals with disabilities, students, and other groups that are typically marginalized in the political process or have historically experienced voter suppression. Online voter suppression almost always is targeted at those groups as well. From that position, there is a lot that individuals can do to help combat that. And we have launched through the work that Common Cause has been doing for years with the Election Protection Coalition, which is the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection group. As we saw vote suppression activities come from offline from the posters and the billboards and the robocalls that are still real threats in voter suppression, we saw that migrate online. We've been working over the last few cycles to build up a methodology that would help stop this kind of online voter suppression, which is a combination of deceptive practices and telling people the wrong way to vote, of abuse and hate speech, and targeting communities for abuse, and then conspiracy theories and false narratives that undermine the legitimacy of the election, or of certain ways that trying to undermine the sense of trust and security in certain ways to vote. So we've seen all that migrate online, and this year has seen a volume of disinformation around voting in elections unlike anything that we've seen in the past. And what we've recognized is that on Facebook, as well as some other platforms, some of the smartest folks in the world who have the best big data capacities are unable to aggregate all the data because it's in private groups. It may be micro-targeted ads. It may be in individual, smaller places where you can't necessarily grab all the data and analyze it and identify it. We've instead turned to the public and activists, not just Common Cause members, but members of our election protection coalition and other organizations, to become social media monitors. And we have a volunteer training program where we ask folks to get trained in how to appropriately identify online vote suppression and disinformation. And sort of the most important takeaway there for folks who are here, even if you don't go through the training, is don't feed the beast. Don't engage with the disinformation or the vote suppression that you see, because as folks who probably know, when Facebook sees you interact with some kind of post, even if it's to put a frowny face or, on another platform, to reply to it or to try and dunk on it and say that this is incorrect, the algorithm reads that as engagement and will amplify it higher in the news feeds and end up showing it to more people. So the sort of number one rule about if and when you as a user see disinformation is don't engage with it. And as Myaisha mentioned before, some of the problems that we see is that communities are infected with disinformation because people are sharing them to those communities in sometimes a good, good faith effort to protect people from it, but the result is they end up sharing that disinformation. So instead, we request that folks flag any kind of disinformation to the platform, but then also to a voter protection organization. The Digital Defense League is one great avenue. They have a disinformation tip line up. Common Cause has a disinformation tip line. Color of Change has a tip line. I'll put one thing in the chat in a second, which is a simple browser extension from the group MapLight, which is a nonpartisan democracy group that made it really easy for you to install a browser extension on Firefox or Chrome, and you can just with one click identify and report to them malign content on Facebook. Right now it works only on the Facebook platform, so it's kind of perfect for this conversation. And I think the reason why it's really important to have those avenues is because we are human, we see something that's wrong, we want to do something about it. And so our first instinct to amplify that disinformation by replying to it and saying this is wrong, or sharing it with others and saying don't believe it, we have to combat our own instinct and instead convert that effort into reporting it. And then I think secondly, if I can add one more ask to everyone who's watching this, lift up the trusted sources of information about voting in elections, about politics, about news and issues. Lift those up to your community, because that's what's going to help make sure that people aren't necessarily falling into these disinformation traps. You don't reply to the disinformation with that, but separately, you want to come up with a way of seeding the ground in your community with where those trusted sources are. And when it comes to something like this upcoming election, it's secretaries of state offices or your county boards of election. Many times they have an online presence, or it's a nonpartisan voter protection group like the Brennan Center or Common Cause or the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, or many others, or a group like vote.org, which has been providing voter protection services or voter education service. So those are the kind of actions that we all can take that will help stop disinformation rampant on the platform and infecting and hurting voters. And I think that's a critical piece to take, not only now, but through the election itself, which will most likely not, the results of some of the races will not be known on November 3rd. So we need to continue to stay on top of it over the course of the days following the November 3rd.
Excellent. I'm going to take two questions from the crowd and combine them into one and toss them over to Yael, and then other folks can jump in. We've been talking a lot about countering disinformation, and there's been a great deal of focus on taking down content, but less so on how to surface corrective and authoritative information. So I was hoping you could tackle that and also tie it into, I think, what's on everybody's mind right now, what happens after November 3rd.
Sure. This is a great way for me to sort of make my final comments. I will try to be short. I see that we're coming to time, and I want to make sure everyone else has a chance to talk as well. I'm going to take those in the opposite order. So November 3rd, to Jesse's point, it's very important that we continue to push the message to everybody that we are not likely to, we will not have our final results on November 3rd. Americans are used to getting their elections results that night. That is not going to happen this time around. So one of the big concerns I've been talking about for a few months and lots of people are talking about is what happens when you have a situation where you've had, let's say you have one party where more people are voting in person. Let's say the Republicans have really struck out against mail-in ballots a lot. So it's more likely that more of them are going to be voting in person. I think the data is already showing less Republicans are requesting mail-in ballots. And then more Democrats, let's say, do end up voting by mail. So that sets up a situation where on November 3rd, if you are able to get access to any of the data, if there's, I don't really know how the media is going to report it this year, but let's say they do, let's say they start reporting that Trump won, or at least it looks like based on how many ballots have been counted so far, Trump is winning. And then he starts to declare victory. He declares it on Twitter. He declares it on Facebook. All of his surrogates do their job to start declaring it. And then within the next few days, as the mail-in ballots start to be counted, it starts to shift. And because Facebook, for example, has kind of given him free rein to lie about the elections, to lie about mail-in ballots, to lie about the integrity of the counting of mail-in ballots, he gets to say, well, see, I told you the Democrats were going to steal this. And he starts shifting to that dialogue. And that continues to spread on the platform. And then he starts dog whistling. I mean, his dog whistles are not even discreet anymore, right? He did it in the debates. He starts calling out to different groups. Hey, look, I told you this election was going to be stolen. Stand up and defend it. And Facebook lets that go because they still do let those things go through. They let Don Jr. put up his post recently, literally calling for people to basically join militias and like defend the vote. And so this is, to me, the biggest nightmare scenario. And so really quickly, I'm sorry, this was longer than I meant to. Some of the things that we've been pushing the platforms to do, yes, Facebook has done some interesting new steps to try to like broaden their voter suppression policies. And yes, they've been popping up labels and they have their voter information center. 2 points though. Having a voter information center, while interesting, that's putting the burden on me as a Facebook user to have to click through to go to another place to go look for information. I'm less concerned about the people who are likely to click through and go seek out other sources of information. What I would like to see is, first of all, when you pop up labels that are both sidism type labels, when everybody gets the same label that says go to the voting information center, you're not talking about the veracity of that actual post. You're not fact checking anything. You're not actually saying this is wrong. And that's why we are where we are today. I, with a group of other activists and academics, have been suggesting things like, instead of that, why don't you flood the zone with reliable information? For every single piece, if you do not want to fact check politicians, which by the way, I will still say is the #1 thing I disagree with Mark Zuckerberg about. I don't want him fact checking necessarily, but in paid ads I do because he's taking money for that. So I disagree with his policies on that. But if you're not, then for every time I see a post from Donald Trump that says something about mail-in ballots or fraudulent or whatever, the next 3 things I should see should be valid, from valid sources, whether it's states elections officials, whoever those valid sources are. You should be flooding my zone with more good information than that. And you have the capability. Facebook has the capability and the power to do that. I'm not asking you necessarily to censor him. I'm asking you to provide me with more good information. And after November 3rd, that is the one and only time where I agree on the both sidism approach. I think a platform like Facebook should label every single post that says anything about elections results with a clear label that says this post is premature, the results are not in yet. Do not ask me to click through. You make it crystal clear, and you have to start tamping down and really enforce your hate speech, your dangerous groups, all of those policies in a way you have not been doing now, because November 3rd is onwards is the true tinderbox until we have an official result. And I think there's much, much bolder steps they could do to protect that period.
Thank you. Does anyone else have thoughts on Myaisha? It looks like you wanted to jump in here.
I mean, there was so much that was said. I'm not sure where to pick up from, but Facebook sort of represents to me a situation where the saying that a fish rots from the head down. You know, we've talked a lot about enforcement throughout this conversation, and again, it has a lot to do with the lack of will and leadership from the very, very top, starting with Mark Zuckerberg, who doesn't see this as a serious issue. And so, like, we're very obviously concerned about the elections and prepared for, you know, when I started MediaJustice, it wasn't too soon after the 2016 election. And MediaJustice is also a host of a network of other organizations. And so one of the things that happened out of the 2016 election was members telling us, hey, we really need some digital security trainings. We need to understand and up our literacy around digital safety, because these next 4 years is going to be us on the ground constantly protesting. And so we find ourselves kind of in the same situation, right? Like, no matter when we find the results, no matter what the results are, our communities of color, folks who are marginalized, need to be prepared. And that starts with, you know, acknowledging if fish is rotten from the head down. You know, resource our communities with trainings on how to identify misinformation, disinformation, training our communities on how to keep their information safe on these platforms, and probably get to a point where we start demanding a different body of leadership at Facebook. Someone that a more accountable body of leadership, right? That won't let scandal after scandal after scandal happen, won't let policy recommendations after recommendations happen until they actually do something to actually protect people that use their platform. So that's some of the work that we're looking out ahead, right? Is like, after the elections, it's really about making sure our communities are well prepared and resourced to manage what is going to be a really chaotic time.
Excellent. Ángel, I want to pass it over to you for your closing thoughts.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I think that the question started out with was what are steps that we can take. You know, I think the platforms, when we started out, we're talking about how even the simpler stuff isn't really being addressed. So when we're talking about surfacing good information, you know, I want to say, look, if you're looking for a particular conspiracy theory or a particular viewpoint of the world, you're not going to search like, where can I get my absentee ballot? You're going to use a different set of search terms to find those things, right? So having a more holistic approach to how people get their information on the internet is hard, but something that Facebook and other platforms should be doing. At the same time, even simple queries like, where do I get my absentee ballot, is surfacing junk ad results. And so, you know, there are simple things that can be taken that should be addressed, and then there are harder ones. And I think it's sort of discouraging to see that on both fronts, platforms are sort of not necessarily meeting the moment. You know, I think that community standards are hard to enforce and to do it well. And, you know, I think that's all well and good, but ultimately it is really discouraging to see how it's not really that the rules aren't clear. I mean, they have plenty of wiggle room. They're written by a combination of lawyers and other people, so there's always a way out of them. But to a certain extent, I think that the number one thing that users of a platform should be demanding more of is actual enforcement of the rules that they're agreeing to. And that also means owning up to the goalposts that a platform sets. Because when you set a post in a particular place, there's plenty of gray area that you know exists. And you're saying that if you come up to that gray area, the content will be okay. It'll remain on the platform. And so it's not a matter of gaming the system, it's using the system as it's designed. So I think it's misleading to sort of make it seem as if it's some sort of like hyper sophisticated thing that people are doing. In reality, they're just saying, oh, this is the rule, I'm going to follow the rule, and this is allowed under the rule. So there needs to be a better, a more thoughtful approach to it. I think that when it comes to misinformation, I think it's important to give people more credit. I think that oftentimes people actually know misinformation more often than they don't. And I think that, whether it was foreign interference, like there's plenty of evidence of activists spotting that before a lot of journalists did. Like, it is not something that is impossible for people to see. But I will say that misinformation coming from leadership is really hard to combat. And misinformation from the top is really damaging and actually has the power to lead to real world violence. And at this point, it shouldn't be acceptable for, like, how much more example of offline violence do you need to sort of know that a person's speech has a pattern and practice of incitement?
Thank you. And Jesse, I also wanted to give you the opportunity to close with your thoughts.
I wanted to thank all of these panels for bringing such great insight and their work on this. I'll just say very briefly, I encourage everyone to spend time promoting and getting engaged in our democracy online and offline. There are opportunities coming up right now to be part of the process of helping make sure every eligible voter can cast a ballot through a group like the Election Protection Coalition, but also through other avenues in your community. And I would encourage folks to do that. I think many times, while the platforms and the rules of our online communication techniques shape our conversation without a doubt, they're also reflective of where we are as a society. And it's important to engage in the processes that can help make sure we build a democracy that includes more people, and you have an opportunity to do that over the next 30 days as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I wanted to thank all of our panelists for sharing their thoughts on what we can do to combat misinformation and to protect our democracy. Yael, Myaisha, Jesse, Ángel, really appreciate you taking the time to surface such important topics with us. And if folks want to see more about the coalition work, they can go to protestfacebook.org, and we will share more information about what some of the guests have talked about as well. So thank you again, and hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.